So, thank you very much for being here. The session today is on website accessibility, and it's all about making your website accessible to everybody and inclusive to all. I'm just going to leave the slides on here. I've only got one screen this morning. So I'm going to start off with a quick introduction to myself. So my name's Matt. I run a company called Charities, and we work exclusively with third sector and non-profit organizations. And we deliver digital design and development services to those organizations, providing support and mentorship where applicable, and also delivering training workshops like this one. Sometimes we do them in person here in Leeds, other times it's via webinar, and you'll find some related stuff on the YouTube channel as well, past seminars, etc. So if you'd like to give me a follow on Twitter, as we are Charity Box, you'll find some more information on there, often talking about the kind of topics that I'll be covering today. And also charitybox.io is the website. There's a blog on there with lots of hopefully useful information that you'll find helpful. The sponsor for this session kindly is a company called Lightful. You may have heard of them. They're a social media monitoring tool. They work predominantly with third sector organizations. It's really good if you need some help with your social media planning, social media management, and monitoring. There's a free plan available. However, if you wanted to get more of a feature-rich application from them, you can pay. And thanks to their sponsoring of these events, if you enter the code CBOX at checkout, you'll be able to get 50% off any of their plans, any of their paid plans forever. So I'm going to send these slides and that code out to you in an email after this, so you don't need to scribble that down right now. So that's Lightful. Thank you to those guys for the sponsor of this event. So I'm just going to go through very quickly what we're going to cover in this session. So we're going to look at what accessibility is. I want to start with a definition so we're all on the same page. I'm going to talk about why accessibility is important and why you should move towards compliance. I'm going to give some common complaints and objections that people often have towards moving towards compliance. There's a lot of perceptions there that stop people from progressing. I'm going to give you an example of a real world situation. I'm then going to talk about some practical steps that you can take towards accessibility compliance. Really simple takeaways from this session. I finish on going above and beyond. So that's looking at how you can take this to the next level and go a little bit deeper into it. Okay, if anybody has any questions along the way, please just put them into the chat window and I will pick them up at the end of the session. This will last about 20-25 minutes and then we'll have a Q&A after that. Okay, so let's go forward with the definition. So what do we mean by accessible? So accessibility compliance is really the process and practice of making sure that your website or your online service or your app, whatever it might be, is accessible and works for everybody, regardless of their abilities, the environment in which they're operating, or their input device. As the image there says, designers should always keep their users in mind. It's not all about designers, it's about anybody who's putting together a service for people, and you need to keep those people in mind. So that starts really by asking a few questions like, are the people who are going to be using this service partially sighted or blind? Do they have any cognitive issues? Do we need to explain things in different ways? Do they have any neurological issues? Can they use the keyboard and mouse? What's their input mechanism? So these are a few of the things that you kind of explore, these different themes, when talking about accessibility compliance. And obviously, compliance takes different shapes and sizes depending on the needs of the organization and its stakeholders. So for your organization, it might be slightly different to others. But it could cover any of the following. user-controlled color contrasts, font resizing. You've probably seen this kind of stuff on websites before, where you can change the contrast and you can select different colors so that it works better for you. Easy read materials, so people that may have learning difficulties, you may need to explain things in a slightly different, more simplified way. Keyboard navigation, making sure that content can easily be accessed via the keyboard if people can't use the mouse for whatever reason. And just simple things like putting captions and descriptive text and transcriptions in place for videos and images, and really just thinking about how people consume that information. So those are some of the things that compliance could cover. It's not an exhaustive list, and obviously you could fit a lot more on there. So let's have a look at why accessibility compliance is important. 1 in 5 people in England and Wales report having a disability. Now, this could be any number of different types of conditions, but it can affect the way that people access services online or otherwise. So that's quite a high number when you think about it. And when you marry that number up with the fact that 95% of charity websites don't meet basic accessibility standards, you've kind of got an idea there of the problem that people are facing. Okay, so this stuff's worth thinking about. Purely from an economic standpoint, there's nearly 12 billion reportedly lost in online revenue due to people clicking away, i.e. they can't complete the transaction, they can't get the information that they need. And it's estimated by an organization called Purple that up to 12 billion is lost per year because people can't access those services online. And I've got a quote here from Mike Adams, the CEO at Purple, the organization that put together that research. If a website is too much of an ordeal or time consuming, then I've already clicked away. It's worth looking at Purple's work, actually. And they also run, I think it's an annual campaign called Purple Tuesday, where they raise awareness around accessibility, particularly in terms of digital services. So that's why it's important. Now, accessibility compliance, it can be a challenge, and it does require some investment in terms of time and money. But there's a perceived lack of benefit, which means it often gets sidelined or ignored. I've worked in many organizations and with different clients in the past myself, as well as being in this position where sometimes you don't want to think about this because it's too much to consider and you think maybe it's not really worth bothering with. But there are actually some business benefits to accessibility compliance as well that I think if you really want to get buy-in with this stuff, you have to get a handle on. So let's have a look at a few of those. So the benefits of accessibility compliance, obviously these two business people here are quite enthusiastic about it. Improved brand perception. If you're an organization that is seen to be meeting the needs of people with additional needs or disabilities, then your perception, the perception that people have of you as an organization and as a brand is only going to improve. Wider market reach. I talked a moment ago about 1 in 5 people reporting as having a disability and the amount of money being lost through transactions. So if you put investment into being accessible, you automatically get to reach a wider market. And minimized legal risk. So at the moment, it's only public sector, i.e. publicly funded organizations that have to, by law, comply to accessibility standards. Private businesses and third sector organizations aren't obligated legally. However, that's not to say that that will always be the case. Things change, right? But also it just covers you in the instance where somebody, for whatever reason, can access your services at the time when they really needed to, and they decide to launch a legal case against you. If you have compliance in place, you minimize that legal risk. Okay, so they're really the sort of overarching benefits of doing this from a business perspective. Let's have a look at some of the common objections that people have. So when pressed, it's very easy to resist this stuff. A lot of it comes from a place of ignorance and a lack of awareness, to be honest with you. So, you know, people may say it costs too much or we don't have the time. And yes, you can spend a lot of time and money on this stuff. But I find that if you just learn a little bit about it, you can begin to adopt some of the practices into your daily routine or your weekly routine whenever it comes to publishing content, making changes on your website, or whenever it comes to creating something. If you think about accessibility, well, actually, you don't need to look at it as one big costly project, as a one-off thing. So, you know, you can break down those barriers by talking about it as a routine thing rather than a one-off project. Another concern that I've heard is that it will make websites ugly. Now, I think this may have been true in the past. You could argue that people that care about things from a visual perspective and people who care about things from an accessibility and a usability perspective, you know, historically those two people were quite different. But actually now web technology and the way that we develop technology for, you know, in the digital medium means that people can access the tools they need to make attractive and visually appealing websites also accessible to people who need it. Okay, so that accusation that accessible websites must be ugly or unattractive or hard to use in some way is very much unfounded in modern design. And lastly, we don't need to bother. I mean, this is something that you hear quite a lot. Why put loads of time and effort into accessibility compliance when really people will just give us a call or they'll get in touch with us in some way or someone will do it on their behalf if they need to? Wrong. Okay, like we need to think about this stuff more seriously. People expect good, joined up services, particularly when it comes to their digital experience now. So much has moved online. We do need to bother, quite frankly. So in terms of an objection, that's something that that can be overcome quite easily. So let's have a look at how we can overcome some of these objections. I mean, first of all, you've got to understand that most concerns arise from simply a lack of awareness. You know, accessibility isn't something that gets taught, you know, all the time to everybody. It is sort of an esoteric specialist subject in a way. So understand that people don't understand this stuff and then empathize with them. You can then begin to instill the business benefits of accessibility compliance. You know, people are going to have a better view of your brand. You're going to reach more people, all this kind of stuff. If appropriate, emphasize a slower cultural change towards compliance. So again, that's not about front loading this and turning it into some huge internal project that's going to take you 6 months to complete. This is more about adopting a mindset of making your services accessible just as an ongoing sort of status, really. So yeah, emphasize the slow change towards compliance rather than looking at it as a difficult project. And then finally, if all else fails, discuss potential threats to ignoring compliance. So that's really the opposite of the benefits there, which is you won't have as many customers, donors, supporters, whatever. You may invite legal ramifications. So there are threats as well to not adhering to compliance. So these are some ways that you can overcome the objections that people have towards doing this kind of stuff. Okay, so I've put together, it's a real world example. It's actually based on a fictional character of my own creation, a woman called Megan, who is partially sighted and relies on a piece of software called a screen reader to read content aloud to her. So if you don't know what this is, Google screen reader and you'll be able to find YouTube videos of it in action. But it is effectively what it sounds like. The text on the screen is read aloud to you if you're partially sighted and you can't access that content. So in this instance, Megan is trying to read a restaurant menu online, right? It's quite a common thing. We all want to see what's on offer before we book a table. But in this instance, the staff have quite unhelpfully just taken a picture of the menu on their smartphone and they've just put that on their website. So it looks something like the picture there. Now, obviously, it's a photograph, and screen reading software, amazing as it is not yet able to decipher text within images in this way. So to all intents and purposes, that menu is completely inaccessible to Megan, who is, as we've said, partially sighted and can't read that content. So what can we do that can improve this situation? Well, ideally, you would make a web page out of the menu, right? So you would just create a page on your website that has a menu on it. Now, I think sometimes it's difficult to do this because people don't have much control over the content on their website, or maybe it doesn't look in the right way that they want it to look. So instead, you can put a PDF up there. Either way, those are typically real text, which means it can be read and interpreted by software, so it can be read aloud to her. So this is a better way of making that piece of content accessible. So I want to just take a bit of a deep dive into some of the best practices around online accessibility. And it's important to as well state that there's no one size approach to all of this. So, these things here are just best practices. They're not kind of like, oh, we've done this now, so therefore we don't need to worry about it. This is just some of the kind of quick wins, if you like, that you can do, hopefully quite quickly. So there's a list here, and I'm going to go through them one by one. So whenever you upload an image to your website, always add a description to it. Because if there's an image accompanying a piece of text and you need to see that image, if you are partially sighted or blind, the screen reader will come across it, but it won't know what it is. So if you give that image some descriptive text, in this case, young boy cuddling, dog wearing a red and white striped collar, I know as a partially sighted user what that image is all about. Enhance your read more links. So you've probably seen these on websites before, read more, learn more, these kind of different things. Well, actually, taken out of context, as they so often are, read more doesn't really mean anything. Read more about what? So what you can do is you can put labels on these links to explain further what the link is about. So in this case, it would be read more to learn more about our impact in your area. And the screen reading software would read that aloud to me. And then I would know, I know what this button is referring to now. Okay. Any questions on any of this, please drop them into the chat window. Keyboard navigation. Not everybody can use a mouse very well, and some people rely on using the keyboard to navigate the website. Now, you should be able to test this at any point. If you go to a website and you hit the tab key, you should see a little line appear around links on the main menu or within the page. And the idea behind that is that the user can then just hit the return key or the space bar and it will take them to that page. So you need to make sure that your website is accessible through keyboard navigation as well. Again, very simple to test, very simple to implement if it's currently not working correctly, but it's worth putting in place. My personal preference here is to avoid the use of carousels or sliders. So you often see these on website homepages, whereby you have some text and a picture and a button to the left and the right of that where you can kind of swipe across and get more content from that section. Now, these, for a number of reasons, I try to avoid. They don't scale down very well on mobile devices. Sometimes you can't interact with them through touch, so you can't just swipe them very easily. the content that's inside of those carousels can sometimes be quite difficult to read, particularly if it's moving. So I was on a website the other day and they'd set their carousel to autoplay, and there was quite a lot inside that on each slide, right? So I was trying to read it, and then it automatically slid across to the next slide before I'd finished reading it. So it's just things like this that impede the accessibility and in a way the usability of that website as well. So try to avoid the use of carousels if you can, and instead go for maybe just one image and one piece of text, sort of a bold statement, rather than lots of different pieces of content within the same area. Hope that makes sense. Hover menus, we often find these on the web as well. And they're problematic for people that may have a neurological condition, subject to spasms, for example. So in this case, I'm going to hover the mouse over the words "our process." And when I do that, a sub-menu appears. Now, if my hand jerks at that time and I lose focus on the text "our process," then that menu suddenly disappears. So what you need to do is make sure that the words "our process" can be clicked on, and then it would take the user to another page with a sub-menu on it, so they can still access that content easily without having to rely on the hover menu, which, as I said, can be problematic for users with some conditions. And also don't rely entirely on color or icons to describe meaning. So color blindness obviously affects a number of people, and they may not see the color in the same way as you do. They may not even interpret the color in the same way that you would. So always, if possible, add some labeling text next to an icon, and don't just rely on the picture itself or rely on the color of it to convey the meaning of that. Be explicit, use text. So there's some best practices. And I just want to go through how you can kind of take this a little bit further. So really, engaging your users is probably the best way to make sure that you are meeting accessibility standards. So ask people what they want to get out of your service. Okay, that's a good way to find out how accessible you are to them. Ask them to write down your service in their own words. Ask people to describe your content. Are they describing things and seeing things in the same way as you? If they're not, and there's a huge disconnect there, then you know there's quite a lot of work to do. In a way, it's kind of good if there is a disconnect there, because you can then work towards compliance. You can work towards better user experience. It's really about meeting people where they are. If you prefer not to do that, you can simply run a survey to gather feedback, get people's information that way. It's more of a quantitative approach, but it can be quite useful if you ask the right questions. And you can also observe people using your website. So running small user experience workshops and things, asking them to perform tasks on your website, and then you can kind of see how they engage with that content and how they use your online services. And there are a few tools that you can use to do all this kind of stuff. So Hotjar is very, very good. I use this myself, and I also recommend it to clients. It anonymously records people using your website, so you can see the mouse move around, you can see the pages that they go to. And it's quite illuminating to see where the problems are. And once you've kind of understood that, you can jump in, you can kind of fix that stuff. So it's very useful in that respect. SurveyMonkey enables you to gather feedback. So that's, again, doing questionnaires, etc. Usertesting.com lets you conduct remote user testing. So basically, you would say, here's a task, i.e., we want somebody to donate to a specific appeal on our website. Let's have a look at how people are doing that. And they would conduct that test on your behalf and give you recordings. People would actually express what they're trying to do as they're doing it. So it's really useful. It can be a bit costly, but it's a nice way of doing this in a sort of hands-off way if you have the budget. And for testing the more technical aspects of your online services, you can use the Web Accessibility in Mind tools, which will basically, you put the website in, you put your website into their website, and it will show you where you may be going wrong in terms of color contrast, if you've got any code issues, if the page is not structured in such a way that would be accessible to people. So again, none of these are silver bullets on their own. It's a case of taking a holistic approach and using the tools available to you to work towards that compliance. And just finally, I'd like to end on some tips here. I think if you were to approach this with best practice in mind, you're trying your best, you are adopting it into your routine. Don't stress out too much about it. Don't be like Stressed Eric here and have a huge pulsating vein on the side of your head. Just try your best with all this kind of stuff, and it does take time. Run regular accessibility audits every 3-6 months. Have a look at some of those tools that I've just mentioned there. See what the data is telling you. Speak to your users, and then find out what's going on. See if there are any areas that you need to improve. And consider your users within your wider service. I think this is probably the key, actually. If you think about accessibility, again, holistically, it kind of filters into every aspect of your work, whether that's your website or whether it's an offline service, thinking about how people interact with your organization and thinking about the accessible needs is a good way to go. And it kind of instills the practice on a daily basis. So there are my sort of closing tips there. Let me just see if we have any questions. Okay, so I've got a few questions here that I'm going to go through. Just bear with me while I read some of these. Okay, so every time I check the W3C website to see if I'm being accessible, I get turned off because there is a lot of info and the interface is not welcoming. So that is the W3C website, where you can basically check your website code to make sure that there are no issues with it. And yeah, I get what you're saying there. I think, unfortunately, there is a level of technical knowledge that you need to have to engage in that system. It doesn't really explain very well what actually needs to be done. I think if you have access to development resource, you should speak to that person, and perhaps they can give you a few pointers on that. If you want to send me an email after this, I would be happy to see what can be done there. But in a way, it's a case of interpreting that information and working out the best practice approach from that. Do you enhance the read more links in the coding or on the front end? So I believe that that's referring to this slide here, read more. So actually it is in the code. If you use a system like WordPress to add content to your website, you can add like the descriptive text onto images. You can also, or you should be able to add what's called titles to links as well. So you can put that in there if for whatever reason it doesn't allow you, if you've got an older version or something like that, you can view the HTML, and it's just a case of adding a label or a title to that link to make sure that it's accessible. So yes, it's a little bit of extra work. You get into the practice of it though, and it doesn't it's not such a problem, hopefully. How do you implement keyboard navigation? Okay, so that was in relation to this one here. So the good thing about web browsers now is that they do a lot of this stuff for you. So you just really need to make sure that things are ordered correctly and are happening in the way that you want them to happen. So, for example, the homepage link on your website is quite a crucial link so that people can get back there wherever they are. And typically, you'll find that the logo for the organization is in the top left of the website, and you can click on that to go back to the homepage. Well, if it's in the top left, you hit the tab key, it will typically be the first, if not one of the first things that is highlighted, that is focused on when you hit that tab key. So the user can then return to the homepage very easily. So to answer your question, how do you implement keyboard navigation? You don't have to implement it. It happens automatically. All you have to do is test your website and make sure that things are appearing in the right order. So it's really about the structure of your content more than it is the implementation of how it's navigated, if that makes sense. So in a way, it's kind of like making sure that you put the most important content towards the top, and then having a hierarchy down the page from important to less important content, and then it can be navigated that way. Hope that answers your question. Okay, what do you not need to do, which you might think you need to? For example, you can use WebKit's speech recognition in your site to do speech recognition, but I would guess this is a waste of time because anyone who needs speech recognition will be using software or a device that already has it in order to cope with the sites which don't do it. Yeah, that's a very good point. I think we're in a situation now, which is a good situation, where these technologies are becoming available to us, to developers, to be able to implement this kind of stuff very easily and quickly. And therefore, there's a lot of experimentation going on with this technology. So yes, I think you're probably right. If you need to have the speech recognition or if you need screen reading facilities, then if you suffer from that condition, or if you're living with that condition rather, then you will have the software available to you. I think it's a good practice though for us web developers and people who run websites to think about this kind of stuff. To answer your question, what do you not need to do? I guess that comes down to speaking with your end users and finding out what issues they may be having with your online service or with your website. Okay. And then once you've done that, you can get a feel for how they're using it and if you do actually need to do anything, because sometimes you're right, maybe you're doing something that you don't need to do, but also you've got a bit of a blind spot towards things that you should be doing. So having those conversations is always a good way to go. Okay, so that's all the questions. If anybody has anything else, do feel free to ask. I'll be wrapping up in a couple of minutes. Just want to finally say thank you again for attending this session. I'm going to make the slides available and hopefully a video recording of this available on YouTube. And I will send that out in an email afterwards. And along with the link to the Lightful promotion. And there's another question just come in. I'll just very quickly answer that one. How do you speak with your end users if they've already given up for accessibility reasons? Are there any resources for doing accessibility reviews? That's a very good question, and it's very much put me on the spot. Thank you. I would suggest if your website is so inaccessible that you can't even get to people, then you would use a service like usertesting.com. You'll get people on there who maybe actually have some specialisms in accessibility themselves, but may not live with those conditions, who can help you move forward. If not, speak to an accessibility consultant who could conduct an audit on your behalf. Possibly if you have customers or if you have users in another capacity, i.e. you have some data on them in a database somewhere and you have contact details, you could reach out to them away from the website entirely and maybe ask to do an interview with them or do a chat with them and find out what you need to do there. But it's a very good point. So yeah, if you haven't got access to your own users, then tap into some of the networks and resources that are already out there. And on that note, I will end this session now. So thanks very much again for your attendance. Look out for some more webinars in the future. Give me any feedback on this if you've got anything that you'd like to add, and I hope to see you all again very soon. Thank you very much.